Hi, I'm Phil,
And I'm Shayne.
and welcome to episode number 28 of My Tech Opinion. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the proposed Australian government encryption laws. Gee, that was a mouthful. So let's get the show underway now. And welcome to My Tech Opinion, episode number 28. My name is Phil Edwards, and I'm in Perth, and I'm in Melbourne, and I'm joined by my regular co-host, as he always is, in Perth, except for our last episode, Shayne Johnston. G'day, Shayne. How are you?
Hey, Phil. How you doing?
Good. Yes, you. I'm not in Perth. I'm in Melbourne. You're in Perth, but you weren't in Perth in the last episode. Is everyone keeping up?
Yeah. You're always welcome to come to Perth, though, if you want to.
I'll get there I'll get back there, I should say, at some point. I've been a few times, so we'll get there. No problems at all. Just a reminder to everyone, My Tech Opinion is brought to you by Aussie Tech Heads Web Hosting. For great hosting plans and support, visit hthwebhosting.com.au and they will sort you out with if you need web hosting done. Yeah, don't go with one of those weird ones who will try and sting you a fortune, as I found out the hard way. When you go to renew, go with athwebhosting.com.au. Great plans available there. So before we get underway, you've been back from your holiday now. We're recording this a couple of weeks after your holiday. Did you enjoy yourself?
I did, yes. Yeah, the holiday is starting to become a distant memory, but because I've been back at work all week. But yeah, from all reports, people at work were sort of saying that I'm refreshed and all that kind of stuff. So obviously, definitely needed the break, but enjoyed meeting you guys in the flesh for the first time. And
that's right, because Shayne, you came in and saw us on Geeks Interrupted, which you can find that on the podcast feed if you want to have a listen to that episode if you have missed it.
Yes. And the whole trip was good. It was good to catch up with Glenn when I went up into the Gold Coast. The footy result was good, but that'll be the only time I mention it.
Yeah, that's right. I don't barrack for any teams involved, so it's fine. So, yes, what else has been going on? For those who have gone, well, we've had a couple of weeks since podcasts have come out and everything. I apologise. I decided that I would do an update of my iMac that I do all the editing on. And I thought, oh, look, I've been doing updates for years and years and years. I'm going to do a fresh install.
How hard could it be?
Well, the actual install was easy. But, of course, when you don't back up everything the way that you're supposed to back everything up, it killed some of the files that I use for editing My Tech Opinion. So I've had to rebuild stuff. So, yeah, that was a bit of an issue. But we're getting there. It's all good. I'm stupid. So I think I got so excited about doing the upgrade that I didn't think about all the things I needed to worry about. So, yeah. Anyway, all good.
Episode
back on track.
Episode 26, Phil.
Yeah, that was episode 26.
Yeah, backups.
Oh, yeah, of course. Backups. Right. Yeah, I should remember that, particularly since we did a whole episode on it. I did do backups, but there was certain little things that I didn't do because they were hidden somewhere and, I stuffed up. But anyway. So that's it about us. Remember, if you've got any things that you want to mention to us about our previous episodes or what's going on, mytechopinion@prosumerit.com is the email address. We're going to continue on with it, though, with our feature topic this week, which is talking about the Australian Encryption Laws. We'll be back straight after this. And welcome back to My Tech Opinion. We're going to get straight into the feature topic tonight on this episode 28. We're just changing things up a bit, Shayne, rather than talking about all this generic stuff. We're going to keep it short and sharp and straight into the meat and potatoes of what we're actually talking about. It's like alfalfa. You just move that aside, like a garnish, parsley, alfalfa, kale.
What we probably should touch on is because historically every fourth episode has been a guest.
Yes.
And for the mathematicians amongst us, this is a
For
fourth
that, and for
episode.
those paying attention.
Yeah. So, like every good podcast, it evolves as it goes along. So, yeah, we're doing something different.
Yeah, and we will still have guests on the show, and we'll have them as topics come up. But we've had even though the things are coming out pretty quickly, we've had a bit of break in recording because of holidays and me formatting machines and all that sort of thing. So we're just regrouping and reconvening our little selves, and we'll get back into a bit of order soon. So it's all good. So anyway, Shane, the feature topic today is the access. They're calling it the Assistance and Access Bill 2018, or as I'm going to call it right now, and this name will not catch on, Encryption Mageddon 2018.
As a show title.
Yeah, the Australian government have introduced a bill to Parliament, and that changes the regime for accessing encrypted information and getting support off carriers. This is the blurb as provided by the Australian government. Encryption and other forms of electronic protection are vital security measures that protect private, commercial, and government data and make the communications and devices of all people more secure. However, these security measures are also being employed by terrorists, child sex offenders, and criminal organisations to mask illegal conduct. The exploitation of modern communication technology for illicit ends is a significant obstacle to the lawful access of communications by Australia's law enforcement and national security agencies. To address these threats, the government has developed the Assistance and Access Bill to secure critical assistance from the communications industry and enable law enforcement to effectively investigate serious crimes in the digital era. Now, that to me sounds perfectly reasonable.
Yep.
But there's different degrees of what this could mean. And I'll be front up right now, and I don't know if you concur with me, Shane. I have no idea where this is going to lead.
No, because it is, and that's one of the complaints that people have had about it, is that it's a bit vague, and it's open to interpretation. But I mean, it does have like a section, well, at least the part that I've found, there's a section on there about limitations and safeguards and all that kind of stuff, which we'll probably go to in a minute. But I think the overall criticism is that it's a bit vague, so it could go in any direction. People are worried about whether this is going to require service providers and software developers to kind of put in backdoors and all that kind of stuff, which, again, is open up to interpretation.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. And I think that if you said, well, businesses and communications providers need to assist government and law enforcement investigations, that's fine. But encryption's there for a reason, and the government itself employs levels of encryption on the data that they use in the transmission of data to ensure the safety of the data. Now, the naysayers are suggesting, and I'm not, I probably err on the side of caution. The naysayers are suggesting that this bill will, if it becomes law, will require companies like Apple, Google, or companies like Telstra and what have you, to provide backdoor access into encrypted communications that are secure, to allow law enforcement agencies in. And the issue, the way that I see it is, I don't think people are necessarily concerned about law enforcement agencies having access to the encryption. Not the encryption, to the data, but to what lengths do they have to go through to get access to that data? And if a company builds a backdoor to get access to that data for a government, where does that stop? And does that then make the system more vulnerable, that the rest of the hacking community, ethical or otherwise, can then start finding other backdoors into that tool and therefore making it open slather?
Yep. What we're probably open to, I think if anything goes pear-shaped, if they do introduce a backdoor, and everyone's officially saying that they're not going to, but if they do, I'd be more concerned about a disgruntled employee that worked for company X that introduced this backdoor, taking that intellectual property with him or her when they leave the company under those circumstances, and then releasing it to the wild.
Look, I tend to agree with you there. This is where I think the concerns are. There's a link that I'll include the show notes from the Department of Home Affairs, which is the consultation process about the assistance and access bill, and the amount of publicly registered submissions. There's quite a few of them there. I haven't read all of them because we'd have no time to record the show. We'd be just reading submissions. But it's a bit of a look, that's where the concern is. Now, the ASIO and the law enforcement agencies are backing this up by saying, and this is again off the Home Affairs website, encryption conceals the content of communications and data held on devices, as well as the identity of users. Secure encrypted communications are increasingly being used by terrorist groups and organised criminals to avoid detection and disruption. The problem is widespread. For example, encryption impacts at least 9 out of 10 every 10 ASIO priority cases. Over 90% of data being lawfully intercepted by the AFP now uses some sort of encryption, and effectively all communications among terrorists and organised crime groups are expected to be encrypted by 2020.
See, I disagree with that 90% mark. It depends on what they mean. If I interpret that as meaning 90% of the overall population that they're monitoring, whether they're good guys or bad guys, because I've heard anecdotally that how it was been explained, especially a couple of times on Twitter, is you imagine a big screen TV, 100 and whatever the biggest one is, and that's all the communication in the world going backwards and forwards over the internet. And the stuff that they can't get to represents basically a couple of pixels that have gone black out of that whole TV.
I think you're right. I think what they're saying is that they've said, well, we want to access data from persons A, B, C, D, and E. Mm-hmm. And of the data that those people are generating, 90% of that is encrypted.
All right. So those people are already kind of, alleged to be kind of crooks in one way or another. Yeah.
So they're already investigating individuals' conversations. But when we're talking specifically about terrorism, things like that, there's also an example here, and this is quite long. A risk. This was on the website. The following example from Victoria Police demonstrates a high-risk registered sex offender, an RSO, was placed on a register for raping a 16-year-old female. Served 9 years imprisonment, is now monitored by corrections via 2 ankle bracelets whilst out on parole. Victoria Police received intelligence that he was breaching his RSO and parole conditions by contacting a number of females, typically aged between 13 and 17. Inquiries show that he was contacting these females and offering them drugs in return for sexual favours. The suspect was arrested and his mobile was seized, but despite legislative requirements, he refused to provide his passcode. Due to an inability to access his phone, as well as the fact he used encrypted communications methods such as Snapchat and Facebook Messenger, Victoria Police was unable to access evidence that would have enabled them to secure a successful prosecution and identify further victims and offences. These are high victim impact crimes that are being hindered by the inability of law enforcement to access encrypted communications. Now, clearly, the Department of Home Affairs have chosen an example that 90% of the population are going to go, you know what? I agree with what they're trying to do there.
Yep, because nobody likes, kind of pedophiles and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the thing is, there's two, I don't know, look, when you look at the justification, you go, yeah, I sort of agree with that justification, but at what ends to that justification and where does that hamper what we're doing on a day-to-day basis? So the way that I see anything, there's an element of risk versus reward. So when I'm developing a password for a website, so I'm going to go to Amazon and I type in my my username, which is mytechopinion@prosumerit.com. Guess what, kids? It's not, so that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I type in my password, which might be I don't know, MTORULES as my password.
Mm.
I go, well, it's an easy to remember password, but the risk is that someone might remember that I'm an egomaniac and that I think that I'm awesome. So that's what my password's going to be. So, you can have a stronger password, but then you might forget it.
Yep.
So the thing is that you've got these particular risk versus rewards. So you go, well, okay, we can have some sort of way to get this encrypted data. And you go, well, we're going to get better successful prosecutions. We might have prevent more violent crimes against, whether it be terrorism or sexual assault or this sort of thing. However, where does it end? And is it saying, well, it makes the other 99.9% of the population who are doing the right thing, it makes their systems more vulnerable and it leads to identity theft.
Yep.
And one of my concerns about government legislation is that the government legislation is well-intentioned, but it doesn't take into account necessarily flow-on effects as a result of that legislation. Yep. So in Australia a couple of years ago, the government decided that Alco Pops, being the fizzy bottled alcoholic lolly drinks, would promoting drinking to underage people, so that they decided to put a tax on them to make them more expensive and therefore prohibitive to users to drink. So, and this is not backed up by scientific evidence. I will make this clear right now. But from my observational evidence is that it didn't stop the kids from drinking.
Mm.
What it did was it said, well, I'm going to go and buy a bottle of vodka, which is only going to cost me $25 to $30 if I go and buy cheap chuck from wherever.
Yeah.
I will mix that in with some soft drink, get the same result. However, as I get more drunk, I don't know how much I'm actually mixing in, and I'm not mixing in stable amounts.
Yep.
And therefore it potentially causes more issues.
Yeah.
And I suppose that analogy is just saying, well, I don't think that they go, well, yes, we need to stop them drinking Alco Pops, but if we stop them drinking Alco Pops, what happens? Why do people go and drop an ecstasy pill, which sounds really old man when I go drop an ecstasy pill, but, whatever illicit substance they're taking, half the time because it's cheaper than booze.
Yeah.
At least booze is more socially acceptable, is more controllable. Some of, not all, and there is a level of addiction, but some of the choices people make when it comes to drugs, and we're talking illicit drugs, are because of price and what have you. Yeah, there's things like ice and heroin and things like that that have an addiction factor as well. So that has other concerns. But at least there is support there for alcohol and what have you in a different way and more socially acceptable way than, say, another drug addiction. Anyway, the point is, after I crapped on about it all the time, is that are they actually looking at what the flow-on effects? Are they going to concede that if they make a manufacturer or a provider get access into an encrypted store, what does that actually mean, whether it be worldwide? The other thing is they talk about, well, hackers could access it. What about foreign actors?
Yep.
What about if they go, well, we know Apple's got a way to get a backdoor into iMessage or Facebook into Facebook Messenger. The foreign actors, whether it be the Russians, the Chinese, whoever, might turn around and go, well, we know that's there, so what we're going to do is work to find out how to get access to it. And we're not going to use it for terrorism. We're going to just sit there and watch what goes on.
Yeah.
And we saw in the news that that we assume Chinese state actors, but the Chinese government have denied it, have been able to insert chips onto key server infrastructure that potentially could have been monitoring communications off those devices. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that they had. There's no evidence to suggest it went anywhere. But the fact that those undesigned and unapproved chips appeared on those motherboards and went to the American Defense Department, major corporates and things like that, is a concern.
Yeah, absolutely.
So where does it lead to? So that's my concern. I don't know what your concern is, Shayne. Do you have a thought on the idea in general, or what do you think?
Well, there's a couple of things. Obviously, if this legislation does lead to some sort of weakening or backdooring of software, dead against that. Although, like I alluded to earlier, in the limitations and safeguards in the legislation, it does say notices cannot require a provider to implement or build systemic weaknesses into electronic protection. The Australian government has no interest in undermining systems that protect the fundamental security of communications. This includes prohibition on building a decryption capability, so-called backdoor, weaken the digital security of Australians and others. So they're all saying the right thing. So there's that's still a concern, even though they're saying it won't be. Not every piece of software that's used is made by Australians or our allies. There's plenty of software that other people would be using that would come out of Kaspersky. I mean, perfectly good antivirus that is fairly common and popular comes out of Russia. So how can we control? I mean, we probably have no right of controlling our allies and asking them trying to get them to do what we want. We're going to have less control over someone, a country like Russia and China and all the rest of it.
Well, funny thing, you mentioned Kaspersky. There's the Five Eyes group of countries, which Russia, of course, are not one of them. But I think that while there's certain different things that are being brought in or have been brought in other countries, other countries will be looking to what Australia does with great detail, because one of the outcomes is that if they believe that they can get some of these requirements through on manufacturers and providers in terms of getting access to the data, then other countries will bring it in straight away.
Yep.
So there's that. And the other thing that you mentioned about Kaspersky, they even made a submission to the government request for public submissions. Kaspersky is an interesting one because while they seem to be providing a very good a product, there has been some rumor or conjecture that because they're Russian based, that there may be other issues with Kaspersky. Never been, always been denied, never been founded, all that sort of thing. But that issue is still there. But a couple of things that they said about the issues, or in their submission, they said in their view, there are significant omissions and procedural loopholes that create risk to providers' business and users' safety without necessarily reaching the stated objectives of the bill. They said, well, the bill explanatory document highlights that provider will be consulted with prior and after serving them a notice. The consultation process and its impact on decision makings are not defined. They also said, and I'm just reading through the major headlines here because the document goes for a while. While the Act outlines the requirement for the decision maker to consider whether the notice is technically feasible, there are no obligations to make legal implications of the notice into account. Take the notice into account. They also said, while Section 317ZK outlines arbitration process in exceptional cases, it still leaves the matter largely in the hands of the same interception agency issuing the notice in the first place. So in other words, they're saying, well, you can go into arbitration about whether this is feasible or not, but the organisation putting out the interception notice is the organisation that will handle the arbitration.
Yeah.
And you can see that there's some issues with that.
Judge, jury, and executioner, all the one group of people.
So they've basically gone, in the main, we remain strong advocates of the cooperation between government and industry to ensure that cyberspace is there for good. Encryption and access are no black and white matters, and in our view, the legitimate interests of interception agencies shall not undermine no less legitimate interests of companies and users. We consider that working on the bill, regulators might have engaged companies in a constructive dialogue at an earlier stage, and that this engagement is essential to moving forward. So they're saying, and I think that some of these concerns are replicated, in a few areas as well. Telstra talk about things. They talk about the various notices that are available hang on, I've got to get the right. There's the technical assistance notice or the technical capability. Ensuring commercial interests are protected, while the draft bill provides confidentiality provisions to protect against disclosure of commercially sensitive information. There is no commercial remedy for a provider whose confidential technical information is compromised. So, in other words, if you you compromise your system because of this requirement, the bill sort of says bad luck.
Yep.
And the government probably go, well, we don't care. They've also said more clearly distinguishing between technical action, technical assistant notices, and technical capability notices cannot require the development or implementation of a technical capability that the relevant provider does not already have. So in other words, they're saying they want some clarification that you can't require us to create an option for something we can't do. Can't, like if we've got it, we can do it. But if we don't have it, you can't force us into making it.
No.
So go on.
I was going to say there was another, I can't think of the name of the company, but it was on the latest episode of Risky Business.
Yes.
Australian company, where they actually make an encryption device. And what they're concerned about is that because they're an Australian company, obviously they're more susceptible to kind of having to, that fall into line with whatever the government wants. And the perception of their customers is that, well, if Australia passes this law and you're an Australian company, therefore, does that mean that you have to kind of, does that kind of somehow weaken this encryption hardware device that you guys make? And, they have got customers that are other governments, other kind of defence forces, other countries, all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
look, and I totally agree with that. And they're one of the submissions, and it might have been Kaspersky or it might have been Telstra, that even said, are you actually going to impact whether it be the security of the internet, but also businesses actually competing in the space? Are you going to have an adverse impact on how businesses can compete if you're under a regime that has these controls?
Yeah.
I think a lot of the concern is what is the from the submissions that I'm seeing, that the government the government is not, I think because the government doesn't understand, to be perfectly honest. But the bill is relatively ambiguous, and I think that provides people with a bit of concern. There's no safeguards or not enough safeguards in there. And does this compromise companies and what they're trying to do with their businesses? Yeah. The Access Now action group, the Secure Australia, have said the bill will fundamentally do three things: create obligations for what organisations must do to assist law enforcement, create warrants to allow law enforcement to seize information directly from a device, and allow law enforcement to access data through current warrants. Now, I don't have an issue with them getting, if they've got a device, I don't have any issue with them getting information off there. It's how they get access to that's the issue. And, they're saying that people are refusing to give them details, which that might send them to prison, but they're taking a calculated risk that the fine for, the penalty for not providing access to a device is going to be less than the incriminating evidence on the device.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's where the concern. There's some stuff here on that access thing as well. It says the technical capability notice would prevent a recipient from revealing the existence or non-existence of receiving a notice, with fines and jail time for those who do not speak about notices. They talk, and well, I've completely sidetracked there, but we'll talk about warrant canaries a little bit. One of the requirements is that, and the United States have this, is that you can't divulge that you have been requested to provide that information.
Yeah.
So what they do, if you've heard of, Shayne, the warrant canary situation, where they go as a standard practice of placing a note in their annual report saying, we have not been asked for information from law enforcement agencies, blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
And then if they remove that line,
they have been.
They have been. Which I think is quite a smart move. So they need to, they're looking at that. I think, again, I don't know what a technical implementation is to get through. The fact is, my opinion, and considering this show's called My Tech Opinion, that's rather appropriate.
Yeah.
My opinion is that that by having these laws in place, and Apple sort of say the thing, what it does is that it makes the general public more concerned, but then it makes the people who are really the criminals not forced, but they find other even hardcore ways to, have the chatter, and store that information.
Yeah, they'll just go further underground. They'll use things like the Tor network. They'll use proxies and VPNs and all that kind of stuff to go through other countries that aren't governed by this particular law.
Bouncing multiple ways and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Did you hear that? And the only reason why I heard it is because I was watching Have You Been Paying Attention the other day. New Zealand have actually introduced a law that you get fined, I think it's $3,200, if you don't provide your mobile phone PIN number or passcode.
I have read about that, and I haven't seen how it works in action. I think it's only if you ever asked. So if they detect that they think you're being suspicious and they won't provide it to you, that you don't provide that information when you're at the airport, then they can sting you. But you got to be asked in the first place.
Yeah.
In other words, don't look dodgy going through an airport.
Well, funny. Father Robert on the Twit network, Father Robert Ballasu?
Yes.
Yeah, well, he's been going to Rome and leaving the Twit network for a while. He's like John Farnham in his farewell tour. He keeps coming back. But he was saying, they were having a discussion about, going through an airport and all that kind of stuff. And he says that every time he gets dressed up in his priest gear, he gets pulled up every time. If he just goes through civilian clothing, they don't question it for some reason.
There you go.
Yeah, I guess
people who look different.
Yeah, well, I guess they also think, well, in his mind, at least anyway, when he's dressed in his priest gear, they think it's some sort of disguise, when it's actually obviously his just regular uniform.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one, and I'd be interesting to see how New Zealand go with that, and would they actually find anything?
Yeah,
that's the thing. Like, are we going to get to that point where? I mean, if I go overseas, I'll take my phone with me. I've got no issue with it. But I know people who are paranoid, and they'll keep an old phone that they wipe and activate just to take it overseas.
All right.
So they will, do whatever apps they need, but they don't have their normal phone. Sorry about it for those watching on the video. I just knocked my table that I'm using, and it just looked like I had an earthquake. They did that. They take different phones, but look, people are getting smarter about things. I just don't know what the answer. I don't know where we're going to head, and where we're going to be in a hardcore surveillance state. They talk about there's things look, they seem to be able to stop things anyway.
Yeah.
And the real concerns that we've had, particularly in Australia, in terms of people that have actually done damage, have all really been lone wolf.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that we know of that have had that have been planning multi-actor terrorist activity, from what we know, I'll make that point clear,
Yeah.
have been have been caught out. We haven't had that sort of thing. The thing is that I think that they focus on, I think, to be perfectly honest, they're focusing on the terrorism and they're focusing on the violent crime aspect of this. I think that there are a lot of things that are involved in this bill that are not talked about because they're not as sexy.
Yeah.
So if they said, we're investigating Shayne for potential tax fraud, of course, you're not fraudulent with your tax, Shayne, of course.
Yeah.
But they might want to intercept phone conversations or messages that you're doing that will provide evidence to suggest that actually occurred.
Yep.
You go, well, okay, that's breaking the law, but it's not as sexy as a group of terrorists are getting ready to bomb something.
Yep.
So, I think that's probably why they're pushing that particular angle, but there's wider range in it. From what the feedback is, Apple have provided submissions as well in terms of, how that impacts. But anything that may lead, and while there are some level of assurances there, there's not enough for my liking from what I am reading about this proposed legislation, that there's nothing there guaranteeing that if they force a company into providing certain levels of access, does that impact the rest of how does that impact other users?
Yeah.
We just don't know.
Yeah. Didn't the UK try to go down this road a couple of years ago?
I think they still are, to be perfectly honest.
Okay, so they haven't actually implemented anything or changed any of their laws yet.
Let me have a quick squiz whilst we're talking about it. The key disclosure laws. So the Australian bill is modelled on the UK laws, which is called the Investigatory Powers Act, which introduced mandatory decryption obligations. Under the UK Act, the UK government can order telecommunications providers to remove any form of electronic protection that is applied by or on behalf of the operator. Whether or not this is technically possible is another question. So that's where that lies.
Okay.
And
they can obviously only enforce companies within the UK, so their phone providers, for argument's sake.
Yes. There was another thing that I was reading. It says, and I think this is where the consistent things that I'm reading on it. It says the new bill. So it says the Department of Home Affairs and ASIO can already access encrypted data with specialist decryption techniques, or at points where data are not encrypted, but it takes time. The new bill aims to speed up this process, but these broad and ill-defined new powers have significant scope for abuse.
Yep.
That line, I think, says the whole thing.
Yeah.
So we're not. I think that the public is not so much concerned about them getting access to data which they genuinely believe, but it's how can they abuse it? Who is policing the police? That's the thing.
Yep.
And, we see often that the police do a very good job in terms of law enforcement, whether it be federal, state, secret service, intelligence agencies, and what have you. But I personally, once again, personal opinion, believe that there is a potential culture in law enforcement circles where they get ingrained in this thing so much that they don't take into account the wider issue, rather than they just go, well, we can do this, we need to do this.
Yeah.
They think everything's bad because that's all they see in society.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, however, the Department of Home Affairs argues the new framework will not compel communications providers to provide systemic weaknesses or vulnerabilities into their systems. In other words, it is not a backdoor. but it will require providers to offer up details about technical characteristics of their systems that could help agencies exploit weaknesses that have not yet been patched. It also includes installing software and designing and building new systems.
So they just want to be made aware of all the 0-day exploits.
Yeah, but they might say, okay, so a great example was that we talked about the chip that was in the servers going into the United States and Australia as well. It says they could also include installing software and designing and building new systems. So, for example, that provider that we talked about that creates an encryption box,
Yep.
Does the government's law say, well, they know that they've got orders going out to A, B, C, D, and E? Are they legally able to enforce that company to provide some level of access in their system for customers D and E?
Yeah.
And they've got justification to do that.
Yep.
That is where the concern is.
Mm.
And, where does that end? Where does it go to? Is this purely on, like, I think this is the thing, the scope is not there. Is this include, monitoring foreign governments? Does it include getting access to someone's phone because they've been repeatedly done for jaywalking?
Yeah.
And it comes down to who polices the police.
Yep. That was one of the other concerns that people have raised, that the final decision isn't made by a court or isn't made by a group of people. It's made by the Attorney General, I believe.
And look, I just don't know. I don't know. To be perfectly honest, like, the Attorney General does have some control. They can do warrants and things like that. But where does it stop?
Yep.
So do you have any thoughts on it? What are your other thoughts on it?
The only thing that I keep coming back to, taking the government at face value, where they're saying that the idea isn't to introduce weaknesses, they just want to be kind of given a heads up about existing weaknesses, by the sound of it. It's potentially like a storm in a teacup. It's potentially a storm in a teacup if they're not compelling other companies or anything to introduce backdoors or any weaknesses specifically to make their life a lot easier. They were. I'm not comfortable with them being given a heads up about any vulnerabilities or anything that is in software. But then again, I mean, that's what the NSA were doing, and that's where all those, when I don't know what year it was, but years ago, when all that stuff got leaked, and there was kind of a big wave of issues around vulnerabilities and all that kind of stuff as a result of everything that came out of the NSA. Yeah,
and I think, look, the thing is I think provider the people are getting smarter, that off the shelf software this is I think where the thing is that if you're sending SMSs 5 years ago, we'll go 10 years ago. We'll say 10 years ago you were sending an SMS from you to someone else. That wouldn't have been encrypted data. The provider would have a record of it. They could get into access to it and things like that. However, if you're an iPhone user, you might converse with other iPhone users through iMessage. You're completely bypassing the SMS network.
Yeah.
If you use WhatsApp, Messenger, you're actually bypassing this SMS network, and they're doing encrypted communications. Now, that's all good and well for you as an individual user, but like the way that I see it, and I'm not a lawyer and I'll probably get shot down, but how can you law enforcement would want to use these pieces of evidence as for evidence against court cases?
Yeah.
Now, if there is a backdoor developed as a result of these anti-encryption laws, and there is a potential exploit, and that exploit can be shown to be potentially there, what's stopping the government from utilising that exploit to actually plant information? Not to suggest that they would, but what's stopping them from doing that? Mm-hmm. Alternatively, if there is a known exploit into a system, how can, particularly on a very high-profile case, how could that be submitted to evidence with proof that it hasn't been hacked?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I personally think, and once again, no legal basis on this, I will say that clear, the encryption could actually weaken some arguments if the encryption is compromised.
Yeah, or if they obtain the data. Yeah. Because obviously they need a warrant to obtain the data. So even if they were to use a known vulnerability, as long as they still get the warrant to get the data at the end of the day, aren't they covered?
Yeah, but they're covered for getting access to that information. But if there is but it depends on how they get access to that information. Now, if they're using a vulnerability or an exploit in the system, and you've got evidence, or you can provide some doubt that that is a true and accurate reflection of the conversation.
Yeah.
Like if I sent you an email that had some legal litigious type of thing, you could argue that, well, it's probably from Phil, but there's also an argument that I could have been hacked and that the email has been tampered with.
Yeah.
So, as we know, email is the least secure form of communication really out there. And while there have been steps made to improve it, it's still insecure.
Yeah.
So if there is something that creates this issue again in terms of the cloud, in terms of these services, and there is an exploit that they might want to take advantage of, but they don't, it's not patched, does that weaken their argument for having that court case in their favour because there might be an issue with the data? I think the thing is that the consistent message coming out of the responses and what have you is that there is a lot of ambiguity.
Yep.
And we just don't know what this means.
Yes.
What level are they forced to go to? And while the government suggests that they're trying to create clear lines and make it less ambiguous through the legislation, the feedback coming from, and we're not talking, Phil Edwards writing a response, didn't write a response, by the way, but, there's a lot of individuals or the members of the public, which I haven't read, but they've written responses. But Apple and Telstra and Optus and Kaspersky and industry associations have all written responses and have said that the legislation or the draft bill is ambiguous, that it can lead to further concerns, and that what you're doing may compromise individuals' data that are not part of investigation. And lest we forget that the cabinet, the federal government cabinet, where Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, whether it continues to this day is another question, were using WhatsApp in group chat to have discussions amongst cabinet members.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why they probably did that is because it's secure.
Yes.
Are they actually making their own communications channels less secure? The fact that the members of cabinet are discussing things over WhatsApp is a concern anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But, that is, like overseas servers, this sort of thing. But this is the concern. I think this is the ambiguous part of it. And I have a feeling that this legislation is going to get through. It'll probably have some minor changes, but nothing of major concern to the government. Maybe to the individual it will.
Yeah. And
we're going to find the hard way when it's either going to peter out and not going to be viable, or the government's getting into a shit fight with be with a company like Apple or Google or Microsoft, or nothing of consequence and it's only going to be great for the country.
Yeah, exactly. The only other thing
We don't know.
No. The only other thing I think we should probably touch on or re-emphasize, if we haven't already touched on it, is the fact that I don't want people to think that the existing tech companies and providers and all that kind of stuff aren't being cooperative at the moment.
Of course.
No, this isn't to make them kind of more cooperative than they already are. They, from what I can tell, if the government go through the right channels and the companies have got the ability to provide the information, they're more than happy to.
Yes. But their concern is, whether it's iMessage or something like that, that if you have, if you provide, like if something's encrypted, they say that they haven't got a way to decrypt that information without, a passcode key or whatever it is.
Yep.
And they will not do that. Now, if the information is probably on an iCloud server, they'll probably do it because they probably can get access to that. But if it's not, if it's through something else, they can't do it. And that's what they're concerned about. Because there's stuff that's held on the server and that they would be what's in there, and that's all good and well. But if it's something that isn't and there's encryption around it that they can't break, I mean, I think it's good that Apple can't just look at all of our messages or Google or Facebook can't look at certain things. That's where the concern is. And the thing is, people are just... Oh, shush, Google. I mentioned the G word. That's where the concern is. Are they going to force businesses or companies to create a backdoor?
Yeah.
And if that's created, does that then become widespread? Because if someone knows it's there, they will go looking for it.
Yep.
And B, it can adversely affect their business.
Yeah.
Like Supermicro with the chip on their motherboard, I mean, they lost 50% of their company value in a couple of days as a result of that hitting the press.
So, while we're on that subject, they're an American company, but the boards were being manufactured in China, and that's allegedly where this extra chip has kind of been whacked on the board.
Correct.
Okay.
So they weren't aware of it, and it wasn't until forensic investigation of the board realised that there was something there that was not in the design specs.
Yeah.
Because they were a design company, and could be subject to this. Apple outsourced their production to Foxconn. They design the boards. They outsource iPhone production to Foxconn, amongst other companies, and do that sort of thing. Does this mean that, if foreign actors continue to try and find these exploits, does that mean companies like, if it's key server infrastructure, will they be required to build it inside the country that it's being done in? We've seen in Australia that Huawei has been disqualified from even bidding on the next 5G networks that are going to be built in Australia. Now, some say that's anti-competitive. We're saying it's for information security. But also, and I'm not suggesting that this bill does, but if this legislation gets through, can the government force the companies building these networks to actually have backdoors in it at design phase?
Yeah.
Hope not, but we don't know. I don't think so, but we don't know.
Yeah.
So look, it's an interesting topic that we could talk about for hours. What I recommend people doing though is that we will have a link to the public submissions and a few interesting articles talk about this on our show notes, so feel free to have a look at them there, make some decisions on yourself, but we'd like you to be involved in the discussion as well. Send us an email at mytechopinion@prosumerit.com. So what we'll do is we'll go to a quick break and we'll be back with our finale straight after this on My Tech Opinion. And welcome back to My Tech Opinion. It is the end of episode number 28. Thank you very much for sticking around listening to us ramble on about stuff that we may not totally fully understand, but we'd like to have an opinion on.
Yeah.
That's what the show's about. I'd like to hear your opinion, as I said before the break, my tech opinion at prosumerit.com. We will be back with episode 29 very soon. We're not sure what we're going to talk about yet, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on what we should focus on in an episode.
Yes, absolutely.
We might talk about video conferencing because we've been having issues with our little system here today. So that could be something we focus on at some point. We'll work that out.
Could be.
Remember, My Tech Opinion has been brought to you by Aussie Tech Heads Web Hosting. For great hosting plans and support, visit athwebhosting.com.au. As always, Shayne, thank you very much for being pushing all the buttons on the other side of the fence, even though networks decide to play up with us on occasions.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Happy to kind of get back in the swing of it after my little break.
I know. It's been a good little break, actually. We need to work out what we can do with our summer series, whether we continue, whether we have a break. We'll work that out. It's all good. We are gonna head off, though, and we look forward to seeing you and hearing from you, or you hearing from us on episode 29 of My Tech Opinion. We'll see you soon, everyone. Bye.
Bye.